Oh hey guys, let's talk a little bit about Mordekaiser's E, Siphon of Destruction. So this is the area of effect that plays out in front of Mordekaiser when he casts his E ability. And there's a few things to keep in mind on this effect. The first one is when this plays, and we're going to see it here in a sec, comes up like that. When this plays, it's not actually indicating that anything happened. That's just the cast area of the effect. If someone is standing in this area, then an effect will play on that character that's totally separate from anything I'm going to talk about in this video. It's going to be an additional hit to show that yes, you were hit by this ability. So the goals of this ability is to just sort of be a subtle touch, a nice indication of this area that was really bad for you if you were standing in it. But the fact is, as soon as it goes off, you either got hit or you didn't get hit. So we don't want it to last too long to kind of show a dangerous zone or anything like that. We want to get it out of the gameplay space ASAP. So it's a nice subtle touch that comes and goes, and I'm just going to break down some of the parts of it. So if we scroll through the ability like so, we can see, I'll play it a couple more times for you, just so you can get an idea of it at full speed and then at slow motion of all the parts. First we're going to talk about the ground crack, and then we're going to talk about the bits that fly up off of it. Alright, so for the ground crack, it's pretty straightforward. I just have this texture card in the world here. You can see the actual size of the texture up here. I believe I just did a 256 by 256 texture. It looks like, though, I probably could have benefited from doing 512 by 512, given, the size of it. I mean, normally the camera is zoomed out, to be fair. I've zoomed in just for this video, so we're seeing it much closer than you actually see it when you're playing the game. But I am noticing some fidelity issues. These cracks here are kind of fuzzy around the edges, whereas the ones in world are pretty crisp. So if I wanted it to be the same as the ones in world, I could have done a texture that's twice as wide and twice as tall. Obviously that takes up more texture space, so you got to weigh out the pros and cons, but I think in this case it would have benefited from that. In fact, maybe if I remember someday, I might go back and repaint the whole texture. It's not likely, but hey, could happen. If you really want it to happen and you're like, man, I can't stand that blurry texture, leave a comment and I'll see what I can do. Okay, so we got this texture. It's pretty straightforward. It just fades in and fades out. It's a regular alpha blend mode. One thing to note on this is I put in a little bit of brown dirt around the crack to help it blend in so that it doesn't just look like a stamp that I just pasted down in the environment, but instead it feels like it's kind of married to the environment, like it looks like this dirt is cast up onto the stones here. Another thing to note is the design itself of the crack. You can see over here there's large areas of stone that are left kind of open. I see a lot of crack designs, where it's all spideried out, and spideried is a technical term, by the way, but basically the gaps, the length and the width of the gaps between the cracks are very even throughout it. I like to leave nice big open spots, areas of rest. In fact, if you look at Summoner's Rift itself, you'll notice that there's big paving stones, medium paving stones, and then small paving stones. And that's a theme throughout the design of League of Legends, is big, medium, and small. We don't want to just have all of our chunks the same size. Okay, that's enough on that. So we got this crack here, and then we got the additive crack. Now, you'll remember from previous breakdowns that I showed you guys the difference between additive and alpha blend. Basically, additive is like shining a light through a colored lens, right? Whereas alpha blend is just looking through a colored lens, So this is like I've shined a light. You can imagine a spotlight up here shining down through a pinkish lens. It kind of lights up the ground, right? It adds to the ground, more and more light. And this is shifting through a range of colors. It's like starting out this deep magenta, and then shifting very rapidly to sort of a desaturated cyan, and then a saturated cyan. It's crazy bright, and then it fades out, right? So it's kind of this wild color over time thing. That's obviously not the color or the texture that I used in the final version, but I'm using this to show you guys the technique I used it's called, what is it called? Texture multiply, I guess, is what we call it, but you might call it something else depending on the effects engine you're using. Basically how it works is you can see this area right here of this cone is the same shape as this, and then I'm also picking up the border of that texture because it's got this thin white line around the border, and then I'm multiplying that texture together with this guy here to create these dots, and then I'm scrolling only the dots. I'm not scrolling the cone texture at all. So you can see that way you can kind of get energy shifting over the surface. If we use an actual nicely painted texture like this guy, then it feels like ghostly energy wisps floating over it. But then, take it a step further, if I fancy up this texture here, and I replace it with this guy, these cracks here that are all like glowing stuff, and then I slide the wispy texture over that guy, I get this. And it's funny because, I'm going to play that again for you. I totally understand what you're thinking right now. You can barely tell anything is happening. And as I was making this video, I was kind of like kicking myself because I realized, yeah, I probably could have used a more defined texture or something here to make it actually look like energy was rippling out across this texture. It's pretty subtle. It's there. There is actually energy traveling out from him across to the tip. But you may never notice it, but maybe your subconscious notices it. I don't know. It's in there. So there you have it. And then here's both of them together, both the additive on top with the crack beneath. So we've got sort of this feeling of like energy is rising up out of the cracks from the underworld, you know. And it's shifting from that red into that cyan. All right. Then we want to up the feeling of, oops. Yes, we want to up the feeling of the energy coming from Mordekaiser, because originally I had done this and the feedback that I got was, man, it doesn't really feel like he's creating the crack, right? So we have some energy coming out from his feet using this texture here. And you see those wisps coming out, and then we'll see them again here. They just kind of burst out bright purplish, pinkish, magenta-ish at first. And you can see these different cards are the different random textures up here that we are using. Notice there's like touches of variation in these as well. They're not just solid pink, they have like little touches of more bluish in there as well. And then they fade off, like so. And this gives us that energy that we need that kind of flows out along the cracks. It just adds that extra little touch of something, you know, so it's not just a random crack in the ground appearing in front of him when he punches the air. And then we have these guys. So these are the wisps coming up, and you can see it's basically the same texture as the wisps that were on the ground, just colored differently. Just do a simple hue shift on that to get it there. And this guy does something a little interesting, because I want to make sure it looks good at every angle, because you think about it, these cards look fine from here, but the moment the camera rotates around, or the moment he faces a different direction, those cards are going to be paper thin, right? And I actually got this question on Dragon Trainer Tristana, like, what if the camera changes angle, like that projectile is going to look paper thin, it's going to look weird. Well, one way that I could have solved it on that, and that I did solve it here, is by using what we call a ray instead of an arbitrary quad. So arbitrary quad meaning it's rotated arbitrarily. A ray means it can only rotate on one axis. So it's going to stay tilted and angled however you do it this way, but then it'll rotate only on one axis depending on where the camera is. So I was able to unlock the camera here and rotate it around for you guys. And you can see how these are reacting. They're rotating on that axis to face the camera. Now, there is that angle, we'll go back a little bit. There is that angle right about, let's see, right here, where you can see this guy is really thin, but at least it's not like, it's very rarely going to be paper thin. You have to have the camera at an exact spot in order for that particle to completely disappear. And all these other guys around it feel, you know, still directional. So it's nice to use rays when you want something flying off in a direction, but it also looks good from every angle. Really handy stuff. And I think most game engines you can either script something like this, or there's already something like this that exists that you can utilize. It's pretty handy. Pretty handy. So we got these little bits flying up here. And then we're going to continue playing. And we're going to just show everything together. So there's Mordekaiser's Siphon of Destruction. And that's basically sums up the whole thing. I mean, like I said, it's all pretty subtle and pretty short-lived because we don't want it to last forever in the environment, but it was a nice little opportunity to give this guy a bit of a facelift, and hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something.